This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. A little provocation today. In this busy, busy world where everybody wants to be the social media influencer, everybody wants to be the lottery winner, and they just know they're going to be it. They're the next one. They're guaranteed. They know it's going to happen for them. Perfection. That's all they see is perfection. The perfection trap, so to speak. My guest today, the good professor Thomas Curran, we talk about his book, The Perfection Trap, Embracing the Power of Good Enough. This is one of those topics. I don't care where you are and what you're doing. We're all living this. We are all in the middle of it. We all have to deal with it. What's good enough? Because perfection, the pessimistic perfection, compete with your neighbor for every issue. That's no way to live a life. No fun. Without any further delay from me, let's jump right into my conversation with Thomas Curran and talk about the perfection trap. I hope you enjoy. What is the perception of the Mike Covel podcast style, Thomas?
In preparation for this chat, I just had a look last night because as someone from the UK, before I was alerted to coming on this podcast, I wasn't aware of your work. But having done so, I know you've done a film about the financial crisis, which I thought looked really interesting, but couldn't access it. But I did look at the trailers and it looked like something that I would definitely want to watch. Seen a couple of interviews that you did around that, which again, fascinating. And then jumped onto some of your podcasts, which again, very chilled out, conversational, but insightful too. You really seem to get to the nub of the issues and get some really good insight out of your guests. So it was nice to do that. And that's why I'm looking forward to it.
Well, given your background in terms of psychology and whatnot, so many interesting names across the psychology field I've had on this podcast. I think those are some of my most favorite conversations because we're essentially just talking about us, man, woman, human. And those are always interesting. Behavior. And frankly, this podcast really got the ball rolling many years ago when Kahneman agreed to come on. And that was like, oh, okay, that's a good early podcast guest.
How did that go? Did you enjoy that conversation?
It was great. It was short. It wasn't that long, maybe 30 minutes or something, 30, 40 minutes. But I think the story he shared about being a young kid on the streets in Paris, German-occupied Paris during World War II, and a German soldier approached him and he was supposed to be curfew and he wasn't supposed to be out. And given his religion, he was definitely not supposed to be out. So the German soldier approached him and essentially showed him a picture of his son, gave him some money and told him to run on home. And Kahneman said, that was what got me into psychology. That was so fascinating that this man who was supposed to hate me, essentially kill me, etc., wanted to share with me. Just to get that little story was great.
Yeah, that's really powerful. For most psychologists, we do come at it from a very personal point of view. I think that's just, if you talk to most psychologists, they'll have a story, but certainly I've not heard one quite as powerful as that one, I have to say.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. Hey, so here's where I thought I would jump in with me and you today in terms of this word perfection. Is an interesting word for me as a guy who's written 8 books, as you mentioned, making a film. I'm currently, for the last 4 or 5 years, been working on a screenplay, which is an entirely different animal of perfection, OCD, and sanity. But there's a part of me that loves it. So here you are, here I am, 2 guys that have written books. You don't get to write a book without a certain amount of perfection in it. But on the flip side, I guess looking at different generations and whatnot, I'm Gen X, but different generations, I can surely imagine that some of the people that are in their teens and 20s and 30s today have been shaped entirely different than someone like myself, who's only had the internet for half of his life and definitely doesn't feel the need to compete on Instagram on any regular basis. So it's an interesting conundrum, as I'll just lay this out as an opening salvo to get our conversation started. But On one side, you got B&U. We have to be perfect to some degree. We have to create these books that people want to check out. But on the flip side, clearly, some of the social media and some of the other obsession type behaviors we're seeing across society, perfection can be a really, frankly, dangerous place to be if people don't see the bigger picture.
That's a great opening salvo there. And I really agree with most of what you said. I think it is true that in order to write a book, a screenplay, or anything creative, really, you need to have a drive, just for no other reason to differentiate your work from the millions of other pieces of work that are out there at the moment, particularly in this digital age. But I think it's really important to start this conversation by saying that there's a distinction that needs to be made right up front between perfectionism, that's to say a striving and a need to be perfect, versus conscientiousness, meticulousness, diligence, perseverance. These things are extremely useful characteristics. They come from a very active and optimistic place where we want to improve ourselves. We want to make sure that what we put out into the world is of a high standard. And we want to demonstrate that we have something here. It's a great screenplay that other people need to see. It's a great book that other people need to read. Now, perfectionism has all of these wonderful things, high standards, excessive goals, overstriving, and all the rest of it that in this modern society we lionize, we value. But what's really important is, unlike conscientiousness, unlike meticulousness, perseverance or diligence, perfectionism comes from a very pessimistic starting point, a very defensive starting point, a starting point that says, I'm not good enough. I'm imperfect. And therefore, I have to prove to other people and everyone and all around me that I'm okay, that I matter, that I'm worth something. And so all of those energies are directed in pursuit of soothing and concealing and hiding in a shame. And in a shame that we are flawed, deficient, that there is some shortcoming about us that makes us not worth something in this world. And therefore, everything I do is to try to prove to other people that I'm not that imperfect person I know deep down I am. And that's very crucial to start there with that distinction. Because once you understand that perfectionism is really at root about deficit thinking, then you can begin to unpack why it's so problematic, not just for our mental health, but also later down the line for our performances. So yes, conscientiousness good, perfectionism not so good. And sadly, what we're seeing, and just going back to your point about generations, what we're seeing is that whereas older generations perhaps were able to strive in a healthier ways, as to say conscientious meticulousness. I look at my father, I look at my grandfather, master craftsman. There was no perfectionism in them, but they had really high standards and they created some incredible things. And then this generation, the new generation, I include myself in this, who are racked with these fears about not being good enough, not being perfect enough. And that's what's driving their perfectionism, which is less healthy.
That is a great distinction, because ultimately we can use these words to describe the two camps essentially that you just laid out. And I guess for lack of a better term, we can just say optimistic, pessimistic, and pessimistic is more the going towards the perfectionist mindset, the perfectionism mindset. But what is driving this, do you think? And let me just also share, it's a little bit difficult for me as a Gen X guy. Like I said, half my life internet, half my life not. I don't understand the pessimism side personally. Maybe I'm just an oddball or something, and I'm not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, using that word perfect, which confused people. And I've got my issues like anybody, but I wake up every day optimistic, and I don't necessarily know why. So I think it'd be interesting for you to share perhaps your perspective, as I brought up the word generation, how what you're seeing is, I mean, I'm assuming it's this idea of perfectionism is much worse with younger people. I'm assuming that. Just as a starting point, is that an accurate assessment?
Yeah, well, that's why I'm here talking to you, because my whole professional life really has been about trying to understand generational differences and levels of perfectionism. And what we're seeing in the data is exactly as you just described there. Perfectionism is rising among young people, and we can identify that it's rising at a birth cohort level. So that's to say that people who were college students in the late 1980s were far less perfectionistic than people who are college students today, of college student age today. So that shows us that there's something about birth cohort, there's something about the generation that's changing and pushing young people in the direction of perfectionism. Now, we can go into, there are many, many reasons for this. And by the way, this isn't a causal analysis, and none of our work is causal. So we don't know definitively what is causing this. And that's important to say up front.
You're making educated guesses. You're in the weeds.
Yeah, we can certainly have an idea. And obviously, look, there's the information technology has exploded. And I think that's weighing on people's perfectionism, particularly with the advent of social media. And almost the perfect lives and lifestyles of other people are transmitted into our daily lives 24/7. We see it all the time. We scroll through Instagram and we instantly feel worse about ourselves because everybody else seems to have this perfect life and lifestyle that we don't. And so to compensate, we curate our own perfect life and lifestyle online. And that creates a lot of conflict inside us between that perfect persona that we're projecting, that we want other people to see, and the imperfect reality. And it goes back to this disconnect between this imperfect person we are and the perfect person we're trying to be. And young people have this disconnect far greater than older people. And I think one of the reasons for that is that social media very much encourages us to do that. But it isn't just social media. I think we see a lot more pressure these days in schools because colleges are a lot more competitive. The economy's changed, Michael. It's not the same as it was in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when the middle classes were large and growing, when people had opportunities without a college degree to ascend in their organizations. If they worked hard, they got promoted. They were able to afford a good standard of life for their family, a house, maybe a car, a couple of kids. These things weren't completely out of the realm of possibility for people coming of age in those times. But these days, that's becoming a little bit more difficult. And I think young people have these expectations of having the same quality of life as their parents, but they're finding those expectations aren't being met with reality.
Let me interject one thing on that. I concur with everything you're saying. I wonder, though, also with the Instagram culture, the TikTok culture, the seeing what your neighbors are doing, so to speak, that's a different mindset, it feels like to me in 2023. Whereas, okay, maybe back in the day, our parents and grandparents and whatnot, they just looked at their neighbors and they said, okay, we can get a house or a car or something and some kids, and that's good enough. But it seems today, I think everybody really wants to be Brad Pitt and Scarlett Johansson. They really want to be a Kardashian. They really want the lottery. I think I don't know what survey work you guys have done. You're going to tell me, but I'm curious about what I'm pushing on right now. Whereas I don't think when I was in high school in the 80s and college in the late 80s, early 90s, I don't think people had this mindset of lottery so much. Whereas anybody, and I think the Kardashians really have helped do this, especially for the female cohort, but I don't think people really thought so much about, I must be an Instagram influencer. I must be famous. Whereas I have a little bit of an internal theory or hypothesis that a lot of people these days are thinking, well, not just a job, not just kids, not just a wife or a husband. They want the Kardashian thing. Is that a fair assessment?
There's a lot of data to suggest that young people, if given the chance, would be a social media influencer. I think it's 9 in 10 young teens in a recent survey said if given the chance, they'd be an influencer. But of course, it's a moonshoot. This is like a 5 sigma possibility. The rich get richer in social media, just like everywhere else in society. And there can only ever be 1%. The point I'm trying to get at here is it's expectations versus reality. It's a sense that they can shoot for the moon and somehow they'll be able to get there. But what they're finding on the vast, vast majority of cases, not everybody's going to be Mr. Beast. There's millions of other young people out there with a microphone in their spare bedroom, trying as hard as they possibly can to get likes, shares, mentions, clout, and it's just not happening for them. And that's the same just as in social media as in wider culture. There are young people right now, particularly in the big metropolitan areas, who are working their butts off. These aren't kids who want to be influencers or whatever. They just want to get on in life, and finding that if they don't have wealthy parents, getting on the housing ladder is almost an impossibility. They're putting off having children because they're in an unstable situation. And they're looking at life and thinking to themselves, this isn't what I was promised. So, yes, Michael, I do agree. There is certainly an aspect of popular culture these days that's teaching young people to have unrealistic expectations. But I would also argue that they are facing an economy, particularly in the big cities right now, that is making a good enough standard of life more and more difficult to attain. So I think there's two things going on here. I think you're right, but I think we also have to also look at what's happening in the broader economy too.
Let me throw this out too. I remember being in an MBA program in the early 90s. And I remember my second year, I got some grant or something for doing some side job at the university. And so instead of having to pay $2,000 for that second year, it was free. I wonder about kids today, especially the last 10 years or so, where young people and their families are continually making this bet that you just said, not what we were promised. Well, I never took out a $200,000 loan for college. So that's a really interesting thing going on here is that this $200,000 loan, and I'm just making a number, but it's not necessarily a non-factual number, but that's a lot of extra pressure too. People are taking this huge bet. There doesn't seem to be, at least from my observation, any learning going on about this, meaning it seems like every year more and more kids are doubling down on the idea that even if the kid that just got out of school after 4 years of playing this game has not gotten ahead, more and more people are lining up to just mortgage away time and money in pursuit of this dream. That also adds to this whole idea of perfectionism, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is what we're told. In order to have a good life, this is what we're told, that you need to work hard at school, go to a good college, get a job, preferably in finance or law, or these days perhaps tech and medicine. You could add that to the list. Basically, what I'm saying is this narrow set of professions, and then you'll have everything that you want: a lovely car in a good neighborhood, family, a lovely house in a good neighborhood, family, car, whatever. This is the good life. And in order to do that, you're going to need to do a couple of things. One is to go to college and take on an incredible amount of debt. And the other is then, once you're out of college, use the wage that you've been able to bid up for your college degree to get a massive mortgage to afford a nice house, and you might get a loan for a car and all the rest of it. The whole promise of a good life these days, unlike a few generations ago, was that it's all predicated on a willingness to take out ever more and expanding piles of money of debt in order to attain it, to push ourselves into a very narrow set of professions. And all of this conditions us, I suppose, to idolize a certain life and lifestyle in our mind's eye. This is what we have to be. This is what we need to get there, and put ourselves under incredible amounts of pressure, incredible amounts of financial jeopardy in order to get it. And that creates, psychologically anyway, an incredible amount of anxiety, worry. And if we don't do these things, we're going to fall backwards in society. We're not going to have the standard of living that maybe our parents had. Incredible amounts of pressure, incredible amounts of a need and a drive. And yes, unfortunately, we're seeing, I think in the data, it's also creating a lot of perfection, a lot of perfectionistic tendencies, which come from, as I said, this worry about not being enough.
We've always had a bell curve of achievement, and there's always been tails. There's always been high achievers on the tails. I suspect what's going on here with all of this social media and this constant comparing is that the overall population, perhaps, especially with younger people, have lost that sense of maybe I'm not really so special. Maybe I'm not a super high achiever. Maybe I'm just average. Maybe I'm just in the middle of the bell curve. Whereas the social media is convincing everybody that they will be an achiever. They will be the highest achiever. They will be the next Kardashian. And, I've heard the ex-professional basketball player, Charles Barkley, talked about this. And he used to always say that he'd go give speeches. And if he was in a room full of white kids, he'd say, how many of you want to be professional athletes? And 5% would say yes. But if he was in a room full of black kids, it was 95% want to be pro athletes. Whereas this influencer thing now seems, I'm guessing, has crossed over racial barriers, and all groups are now imagining they're going to be the professional athletes, so to speak. Is that what you're seeing in the data? Is it literally the younger generations are all just dreaming of this stuff nonstop, and in turn are unable to make good life decisions?
Definitely. There's no doubt. There is absolutely no doubt that social media, Instagram, TikTok, they certainly celebrate these impossible expectations. And as a consequence, young people see that and think that's their ticket into this amazing life that they see other people living. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think young people do have expectations that are way beyond what's reasonable. Even at college, if you ask young people, do you want to get a college degree and are you going to get a college job? Way more young people say that's what they're going to do, that's what they want to do, than the amount of young people that actually do those things as they get older. There's definitely a sense that expectations are way out of whack with reality. And social media is one of the reasons for that. I think there's also a socioeconomic dimension to this as well, because in certain communities, I come from a poor community and I relate a lot to what you just mentioned there, because that was my aspiration too.
To be a footballer?
To be a football player, because in those communities, there is no other escape hatch. You're either going to be a sports star or you're probably going to be, I don't know, a construction worker, or you'll stay in your community basically, which, by the way, is no bad thing. This isn't me speaking down on those communities. I think my brother's a construction worker, my father's a carpenter. There's no shade with those industries at all. But my point is that what I'm saying is that if you come from those communities and you want to elevate yourself out, then it's really sport or some influence or stardom that people are really drawn to, because the other avenue seems so far away, which is completely bizarre because they're much closer. But it feels further away. This idea that I'm going to get to the LSE or, I don't know, Oxford or Cambridge from where I started just felt completely impossible. That would never happen. It would never cross my mind for that to happen. Even though it's a remote possibility, it's much more likely than it is for me to make it to the Premier League. Can you see what I'm saying? But the point is that your frame of reference is so skewed when you see all around you these images of people that are living these amazing, luxurious lifestyles that are like you. And you think, well, if I do X, Y, and Z, then maybe I can be like them too, ignoring that there are other avenues that you could take, which would secure your future probabilistically in a much better way. I think there's definitely a frame of reference skew here that's going on among young people.
Let me bring up an example that just struck me. And I'm sure today, look, everything today is controversial. But back in the day, in the early 1980s, they had something called they still have it, the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue. It would come out once a year. In the early 1980s, it was what you would typically expect. It was just some of the most famous models that existed in the last 50 years. And they generally were unattainable. You would get the Sports Illustrated issue and you'd be like, they're unattainable. But in my regular life, I knew many attractive lady friends. But it wasn't like, I don't remember my lady friends, girlfriends trying to be the Sports Illustrated swimsuit model. But now today, it seems like everybody, I'm going to guess it probably affects women more, but look, there's plenty of men running around on Instagram trying to show off everything too. But it seems like everybody wants to be that. Now, here's the caveat here, the extra punch, which is interesting to me. At the same time, our weight and our appearance generally across populations continues to rise in the Western world. Whereas you might have had a certain look and feel of these, quote, supermodels in the early 80s. Today, people are not looking as nice. There's been so much extra weight gain. How is this tying together in terms of the mental side? Because I'm curious what your work has uncovered in terms of the weight gain. To me, it seems like weight gain across Western society, populations that have money, this seems like there's depression, a lot of depression rooted in this. Because otherwise, if you're happy, just like you talked about your family and the conscientiousness and the meticulousness of working with furniture, I think most people, if they're happy, they'd say, well, I really shouldn't have all this extra weight on me. I really should be going for a walk. I really should be doing something, but they're not. I'm not throwing darts in the dark, but it seems these things are all connected in a way. How do my observations strike you?
Well, Michael, everything's connected at most basic level. I think what's going on here is that we have a world, we have an economy that spins on an axis of consumption. We know that in order for the economy to grow, people need to consume, because that consumption creates new jobs, new businesses, economic activity, which then reinforces itself, grows the economy. However, we haven't really thought about what's good growth or what's bad growth. It's just growth is good. And it doesn't matter if pushing things that are harmful, it doesn't really matter as long as the economy is growing. And so what we've seen is a proliferation of aggressive advertising, the reduction of production costs on food, and addictive platforms like social media and television that keep us seated and not moving, all in the service of increased consumption, 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 consumption. What we're seeing is really the end point of that in some ways today, where you've got this obsessive push to be more, to do more, to look healthier. But at the same time, that's running into social conditions, diet, food industry that's making it a lot harder to live a lifestyle that other people live, right? Like food is cheaper, calorie high dense food that people eat, carbohydrates that has very little nutritional value. These things make us feel good. They increase serotonin. And for the moment that we eat them, they soothe these anxieties and worries that we have about how we look or how we appear. So that's why they can become addictive. And at the same time, we're kept seated, we're kept out of the real world. We're not running, we're not exercising.
Do young people know they're in the middle of this? Do they instinctively know they're in the middle of this? Are they able to see it as clearly as you and I are talking about it?
I don't know. I think there is a sense that those young people that I interact with have a basic understanding that this is just how the world works. The thing is, if you can understand what's going on here, you can start to make healthier life choices. And I think there's no reason why you have to get suckered in by the food industry or the social media industry. You can reject these things and live more basic but happier lives. Perhaps our fathers and grandfathers and all the rest of it who had, I would say, much more backbreaking work. And certainly it wasn't any easier for them, particularly with living standards and conditions. But at the same time, when I look at my grandfather, it just never seemed to have the same anxieties or hang-ups that I might harbor and young people today might harbor. And I wrote about him in my book, actually, because I think he's such an interesting example of the difference between the way that we live today, the existential worries about being good enough, having enough, looking good enough, and all the rest of it. Whereas my grandfather was just motivated by leaving things in the world that other people needed to use. He just made everyday things. And actually, his work is still in the pubs of Northampton, where I grew up today. So I can go to those places and be reminded that this was his vocation. There's something really liberating about that, to know that you can live a very happy, contented life without the trappings of modern society and modern consumption. That was really reflecting on his experience as it made me think a lot about my own experience. I think what I'm driving at when I say today's culture has completely changed and we are expected to have these excessive standards for ourselves that we simply cannot meet, I think is all a function really of aggressive consumer culture that's teaching us we can have everything and we can and should have it all in perpetuity and with no limits. Unfortunately, that same culture doesn't teach us the caveat that in order to have those things, we also need to have discipline. We also need to have some self-control. It doesn't teach us that.
This is one of the reasons I like living in Vietnam. Look, there's 100-story towers in Ho Chi Minh City, or at least there's one, and there's multiple tall buildings. There's many billionaires in Vietnam. But the average person is still connected to the hometown in some way, still connected to farming in some way, still connected to a lower, let's say, economic, not output, but they just have there's less chance of making the big money, so to speak. Enough to live, enough to get by, enough to have a great life, but not enough to compete with, for example, America. It's a different annual average salary that's coming in. And I think I have really enjoyed being around people that feel closer to the earth. Now, don't get me wrong. There are plenty of people in Vietnam, like every country, that are in love with social media and they're on it every day and they're showing off everything. But even in the midst of that, I still find they're a little more grounded. Now, unfortunately, perhaps that all changes in the future. As the world gets smaller and smaller and smaller, maybe we're just all going to influence each other into Harry-Carry. But that's one of the reasons I like being here, is for that. Some of the very things that you're talking about, there's a sense of realness that I can still come across every day, a sense that some young person, perhaps in their 20s or even 30s, who is not making a huge amount of money, but clearly a very bright individual, and just a smile on their face. They're happy. That's endearing to find that. I don't find it in my home country as much. I find in my home country, America, and look, okay, plenty of Americans are going to be listening right now and they're going to say, Mike, you don't know what you're talking about. Well, I don't know about that. But I find far less happiness when I go to America. I find more complaining and more just less smiles on the face, so to speak. And that's what I'm looking for. I want to be around people smiling a lot.
The data will support exactly what you're saying. There are epidemics of mental distress right now in the US, the UK, Canada, all across the West. Social scientists like myself are trying really to piece together what the hell's going on here, because you have countries which are essentially the most developed countries in the world with life expectancy falling, rates of mental health, I've just mentioned, declining, opioid crisis in America. This is a crisis of distress. 80,000 people last year lost their lives to opioid abuse.
It's insane. China and Vietnam, at various stages in the last 100 years, had these issues. They had the opioid issue. And I don't know exactly how they resolved it, but they resolved it. And it does seem like the permissiveness, and this is probably another issue, perhaps even tied in with the perfection trap, that permissiveness, why is this good? I remember going to Amsterdam for the first time in the 90s. The whole thing, in Amsterdam, you could do anything. And it's like, it's kind of okay, small European country. That's cool. That's quaint, a little bit different. But if the whole world becomes Amsterdam, we're not in a good place.
I think it just, as I've mentioned, it goes back to expectations and reality. The thing is, in the US and in the UK, but certainly in the US, even a very high level of income is not going to be enough, particularly in those big metropolitan areas where cost of living is just out of control. So it's tough. It's tough to be contented. It's tough to sit still and find serenity living inside a culture. And this is the important thing. Living inside a culture, we just come so blinded to the absurdities of that culture that we scarcely recognize them as absurdities at all. It's only actually when you step out and look at this from the outside, you can see that's absurd, that you've got someone working 5, 6, 7 days a week, 10 hours a day, just to stand still. And never mind to improve their lot in life, just to stand still, just to pay off the debt. I think this is where a lot of this discontent is coming from, a lot of this frustration is coming from, a lot of the things that you've recognized in America where there seems to be a lot of pessimism. I think it's all coming from, and it's bombarding from every single angle, whether it's social media, school, college, parents, whoever, telling people that this is the life that they should expect. And that if they do X, Y, and Z, they'll get it. And they're finding that they're doing X, Y, and Z, and they're not getting it.
Can I ask you, were you a good student? You must have been.
No.
Really? Okay, I'll share with you about me first. I was probably a guy, if I guess 92, 93 to 100 was an A, I probably left high school with like an 87, which was, I don't know, basically B or something. But I remember in college, it was the same thing for me. I just remember being, why am I doing this? Why am I memorizing these particular subjects to get these particular grades for what particular end? I remember thinking this as early as age 14, what the F is going on? And then looking at my peers thinking, why are all you folks buying into this? Why are you buying into the idea that if you achieve, quote, merit based on what these people are telling you is important, that you will then win the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow? And that always struck me. I knew it was always a little bit different to have this mindset of not trusting the system, not trusting that if I compete to get the grade, which means I've got to go memorize. And that when it's all said and done, there'll be somebody standing there at age 22 after undergrad, or maybe age 24, 26 after grad school. There'll be someone standing there to take care of me. And I know so many peers that were just, that was what they were seduced by. And look, if that was my Gen X peers seduced by that, I can't imagine today the seduction that takes place, that if you just get this score, little Johnny, you will have a fantastic life. Just get the score. And it's all memorization. It doesn't, the thinking on the feet, being curious, the digging into, the research, all that stuff, which is what I ended up having to do to write 8 books. That doesn't come across in school, in my opinion.
No, and I'll share a little bit about my experience. Growing up in a town that didn't have much, the small town experience in the UK is not so dissimilar to the small town experience in the US. Maybe a few differences, religion, maybe hunting and all the rest of it we don't really have in the UK. But in terms of the economic deterioration, the stagnation, well, this is exactly the same. And I grew up in a town that was actively stagnating, that had all the middle classes had fled to the bigger cities for the jobs. The town centre was shrinking irreversibly. just propped up by betting shops and fast food chains. I was actually back there recently and it's declined even more.
Is it vape shops now? My hometown is vape shops and massage parlors. And I'm 15 miles outside DC with mansions everywhere. And the commercial center is vape shops and massage parlors.
Yeah, it's basically that, but the British equivalent. It's been ground down very slowly, almost a death by a thousand cuts thing. And this is a very similar tale. So in those towns, growing up as a kid, you don't really have any academic ambition anyway. Certainly there were people want to be good tradesmen. There's a lot of my friends that went into the army, that a lot of them did very useful things. But there wasn't, if you were to say to someone, oh, you're going to go to Oxford or Cambridge, you'd be laughed out of the pub. It just doesn't, it wouldn't be a thing there. There was no ambition really for me to work hard until Tony Blair took over. Tony Blair's similar to Obama in the US, this big democratic movement, liberal push for education. So here's the thing. We were told as kids, now what you need to do, you want to escape out, hatch out of these towns, is to get an education and to excel in school and college. And I was whisked away on this tide of education. I was paid to go to university. I didn't go to a very good university because I didn't get very good grades, but I still went to university, which is unusual for someone from my town. I was paid to go through the system, and then I elevated myself from there into the new academic world, and it was crazy. But all the while, there's this great push now to do well at school, to get good grades, because that's how you're going to better yourself. And I suppose for me, that's worked out handsomely because I have, I suppose, lifted myself up a social class and I have a better standard of living than my parents. So it's worked for me. But for the vast, vast majority, it hasn't worked. And actually, it isn't working, even though we're still told you got to go to college, you got to get a degree. This is the path. Young people are coming out of the college now to find wages haven't really gone anywhere, particularly in the UK. It's a different story in the US, I understand that. But wages haven't really gone anywhere. Jobs that are available are insecure, and you got to jump and hop from one job to the next. And you never really feel any permanence. You never really feel any stability. And all of this good life that you're promised, this elevation into this wonderful middle-class world, starts to feel really empty when we get into the reality of that, which is excessive amounts of work, loads of debt, and that difficulty to move on in your life.
Let me shift you, though, because we've laid out a little bit of the pessimistic case, but there's an optimistic part to your book title, the subtitle, and the phrase, good enough. We should probably share, at least me and you back and forth, maybe some of those experiences where people can take away the good enough. What's good enough? Ultimately, the people have to be able to embrace your subtitle to get past the perfectionistic traits and addictions that people have. Because if they can't find good enough, you and we've both laid out the scenarios. How do you find good enough? And maybe, again, I share with, look, some people can say, well, hey, why don't you go live in Tokyo? Why don't you go live in Singapore? I love Tokyo. I love Singapore. But, I go there. This is boring to me. Not for the moment. The food's fantastic in Tokyo, the best food in the world, in my opinion. Singapore is an intellectual, architectural, sociological dream, so to speak, for 5 million people. But there's no soul there. There really isn't. And I've had these conversations with my Singaporean friends when they come to Ho Chi Minh City and why they love it. So I think it's one of these things. What's good enough? For me, it's good enough to be in Ho Chi Minh City. I don't need to be anywhere else. I like to be around people that are happy and smiling overall. And that's intriguing to me. That's interesting to me. But the good enough part is really key here, isn't it? That's the pivot for me and you to really bring people into, which is, how do you find that?
Absolutely. It's so, so important. It's one of those things where I think for me to lay out, to say to people, okay, look, I understand there's a compassionate case for explaining to people that the way you feel is normal, natural, I suppose inevitable inside a society that's always pushing you in a direction of insecurity, uncertainty. That I think is the first step. So for us laying out, I guess you could call it the pessimistic case, is really just, for me anyway, trying to explain why is it that we feel like this? And then from there, we can start to reframe. We can start to try to pull back on those expectations and rationalize our current life circumstances, to try to understand that in this world, there's always going to be setbacks. There's always going to be roadblocks. There's always going to be things that don't pan out the way we planned. And that's okay. That there's something quite humanizing about not being able to have something in the moment, failing, falling short, even maybe regressing if we enter a moment in our lives where, let's say, we have a health scare or we have a moment of grief. These are normal, natural parts of being a human being. They happen to everybody and all of us all the time. And understanding and accepting that life isn't going to be this ambrosial land that we hold for ourselves in our mind's eye. And it is going to be tough and it is going to be difficult at times. And it isn't always going to go the way we think it's going to go. That really is, for me, that's helped me live much more contentedly in the knowledge that what I have in this moment is enough. And yes, I can be aspirational. I want to learn more. I can try as hard as I can to move myself up the career ladder, buy a nice house, and all these things that are very important for a stable and happy life. But at the same time, I can recognize that where I am in this moment on that journey means that it's enough, that it's okay, that I'm where I should be, and that's okay.
You sound like a Buddhist professor now, as I happen to be in a Buddhist country.
Well, all roads lead to Zen Buddhism. If you look at one of the most famous psychotherapists in the area of perfectionism, Karen Horney, was writing in the 30s and 40s. She was talking a lot about these issues that we talked about, expectation versus reality, and trying to be somebody perfect that takes us away from ourselves. She was very clear that in order to reclaim that identity for ourselves, that's to say, bring ourselves back to ourselves, we need to live more in the moment. We need to enjoy what's happening right now. We need to feel a sense of pride and accomplishment in what we've achieved, not what we could achieve or what we should achieve, but what we have achieved. And that's so, so important in terms of our psychological health.
I'll share one with you that happened to me recently, a relationship situation where I wanted to pursue something and she did not. And I got the no. But what I did is I gave her my full intentions. I expressed, very nice things, my full intentions, and I got the no. Is it a permanent no? I'm not sure. Maybe 95% permanent. But it's a great example of that up and down type thing. And initially, maybe for a day, this was pretty intense. But for a day, I was like, wow, that's not so good. Because I think, okay, I'm a pretty powerful guy. I can do this. I can do that. I've done a bunch of stuff. I don't like failure. But then I actually sat back for a moment. I felt happy in a way because I said what I needed to say and she just wasn't there. And so instead of clearly this, as you just mentioned, this is these down moments, these uncertainties, they happen to all of us. But I'm not going to say I necessarily embraced it, but I didn't feel like it was the end of the world. I just felt like, okay. And I think this is where you're really getting at, is that we've created, look, you and I have talked about it in this conversation so far, but you can either be in real life or you can be in a fantasy, bottom line.
And at the moment, lots of younger people, and I include myself in this, by the way, I have been drawn into this trap too, living with unrealistic expectations of everything, by the way. It's not just what career we should have or what house we should have, what car we should own, what family we should have, the things in our lives, holidays, lifestyles, commodities. Everything at the moment is just completely out of whack. What most people can attain. And really, instead of wishing and craving and wanting and yearning all the time, which is not going to make us happy and is ultimately going to create a lot of despair, it's about accepting life as it is and our circumstances as they are. And when we do that, we're not just able to live more contentedly, but we're way, way more resilient when things don't turn out the way we planned, because we're able to let them go, we're able to rationalize them, let them to almost sort of wash through us as, well, this is just life. And this is what it means to be a fallible, exhaustible human being. Things aren't going to turn out all the time, and that's okay. And as I said, psychologically, first of all, that's like taking a sledgehammer to perfectionism, because there's no need for perfectionism in that world. There was no need to pretend to be somebody else, because what you are in this moment is enough. But not only that, we can live more fuller lives with more purpose. And actually, the data is really interested on this, Michael. If we're able to do these things, we're also going to be more successful. And for me, that is just, I think that if there's one thing that I want my book really to teach people, is that it's not just, this isn't just going to be better for you psychologically in your health, but you're also going to find that you're going to be more creative, You're going to work with more fulfillment and more purpose and more energy and vitality, and all of those things help with your performances. So there's nothing to lose, really.
I'll give you a hack that I use. So I've been practicing yoga for a long time. I'm pretty good at it, but I'm not the greatest meditator by any stretch of the imagination. So my meditation, what I generally find is if my mind is going a million miles an hour, and I know if my mind is going a million miles an hour and I'm just overthinking everything, I know that's not a good place to be. So my hack is go sweat, go move, because we cannot think it through. We're completely still on the animal side. So for me, instead of just sitting there and thinking, oh, I'm so smart, I could just sit on the couch and I can think through all these worries and concerns. No, I can't. I go sweat. And if I go sweat, I go for either a walk or yoga or exercise of some form. The mind just stops. And then all of a sudden you're happy again. It's almost, for smart people, it's almost like, hold on, is it really that easy? If you just go do some exercise or break a sweat or something, that you can turn off all that thinking and turn off those worries and turn off those concerns. I think it's that easy.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Everything now has to be a grind. It has to be a hustle. It has to be hard. You'd just suddenly turn around to say to someone, there's a really simple solution here. And that's to just allow life to come into you a little bit, move more, eat healthier, do things that go back to basics almost. That for a lot of people would sound much too simple. There has to be a harder way, but it's not the case. That's not the case at all. Slowing down, taking a breather, getting out there and moving is so rejuvenating and makes you feel so much vital, both in your mind and in your body. And that has incredibly strong effects on your well-being, but also your performances. You can call it a hack, or you could just call it going back to basics.
The book, The Perfection Trap, Embracing the Power of Good Enough. That's a nice title, really. It's a nice title because it's something where we all instinctively, intuitively, at least I think we all know, but different generations have different understandings of this issue, but it's something that we probably do all instinctively have a feeling that something's not right and that whatever we've been sold, probably not the best prescription. So it's probably best to head into the old scientific method and try and experiment a little, and don't just trust the Borg to tell us what to eat, what to do, etc., but to actually try and find out what actually might make each of us feel better. And usually that's probably something we all have to learn on our own.
Thank you, Michael. I really appreciate that.
Where can we send people, Thomas? Where's the best place we can send people to? Book on Amazon, all that fun stuff. But what about, is there a website you'd like to direct people to?
Yeah, you can find me on tomcurran.com, Tom spelled Thom, Curran spelled Curran.com. And I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn too. Just Google Thomas Curran and it'll come up.
Cool. Thomas, thank you.
Thank you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.